Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Concurrent session 2 is using a Blackboard assignment,
A blog.
blog assignment to help science students become better communicators. Please welcome Julie Track.
Okay, good morning. Okay, kick me in the knees if I'm not so coherent.
Never.
Most of us are probably a little sleep deprived. I'm not sure how many of us science people are night owls. I have a feeling quite a few of us are. Okay, so, whoops. Something. Okay, yeah, all right. I forgot what the order of these were. Okay, so what we have here, because we're talking about a blog assignment, and this is being done on Blackboard. It's online. So I had worked on a project with a colleague a number of years back as I was sort of entering to this foray of, working with Blackboard in this manner. So we dug through the literature, and we were there's research showing that development of community, which could be done through helping students with communicating amongst oneself, can help student engagement. And as we know, if students are more engaged in their classes, they're that much more likely to stay in school and be successful in their academic work and work their way through the pipeline and join the workforce in a successful manner. We also know from the literature, and I think people have seen that, or at least my colleagues have seen that because I haven't tried doing hybrid or asynchronous courses, that when you have distance learning going on, it may cause students to feel very disconnected. And that also can be a problem when they're disconnected. They feel less rooted and less engaged, and so it can be a sort of a vicious cycle. So that's somewhat talked about in that second point, although we got a little scattered. Okay, good morning. So adding to all of this, or compounding the problem, this is true of all the pretty much all of the CUNY campuses, but maybe even more so in some campuses like Hostos's. The students also are somewhat separated, even when they're physically in a classroom, because they have different backgrounds, in many cases, different languages. And I'm sure a lot of us have seen where students cluster, in their little enclave, speaking Spanish or Patois or Urdu or whatever. Have enough difficulties when I got my colleagues all of a sudden, like I'm standing there and they're all, just all of a sudden breaking out into Spanish, and I'm like somewhat fluent in Spanish, and it's like they're rattling away, and I'm like, and then they even forget sometimes like last night I had a colleague, like he's walking into his office and he knows me very well, and all of a sudden he's talking to me in Spanish, and I'm like looking at it, and I'm like, please repeat that. So, it's like it's a student level, it's faculty level, culture levels, which we sometimes don't think about because it does definitely go beyond language. And in addition to that, we've got students with all sorts of responsibilities, and that's certainly true of CUNY campuses and a lot of community colleges across the country, and probably a lot of colleges like in urban areas where students are juggling work, family responsibilities, and so forth. And as you know, CUNY doesn't really have much in the way of housing, so pretty much all of our students commute. So just like we often spending a lot of time working on the subways, etc., they're doing the same thing or attempting to. All right. So in this work that I was doing with my colleague, we were looking at blogs and wikis and discussion boards, etc. And there was something about discussion boards that really grabbed my attention. I'm not the most avid user of Blackboard. I use it a little bit, certainly deposit my syllabi on there. But there was something about this that grabbed my attention. I do a writing intensive microbiology course. Okay, so getting students to write in all sorts of different manners is useful. So this slide sort of carries down a lot of a number of the advantages of using a blog. At the time, I was culling this information from the different research articles, etc. There was maybe a little bit more of a difference between discussion boards and blogs. What I liked about blogs, besides obviously giving students a prompt of some sort, it would allow for the students to not just write text as a response to that prompt, but they could also use visual information. And that wasn't really available at the time with the discussion boards. I think that's changed over the years from what I've seen in other presentations. The information is archived, and then students, if you set it up properly, all students have access to the responses to all of the other students, which to some extent is also true of discussion boards, but I think it's a little bit more readily available to the students. And so students can write their response, and then students can work from those responses and sort of ping pong back and forth from one another. And also referring back to my prompt, and there's a little bit, I think, easier flow than the threads that occur with the discussion boards. So the idea is you develop a prompt, and hopefully the students are reflecting and writing good, valuable responses, and then the students are looking at those responses and responding, at least in an ideal situation. You will see in some cases it's worked better than in other cases. So the students, in seeing that they're providing information to their fellow students, and in some cases going, wow, or like, oh, my feelings are different about this. So you're developing, like a conversation, and you're also developing a feeling of community. Now, a lot of my students in this writing intensive class are pre-nursing students. So they, have to develop their communication skills, and at some point they're going to be in their community health leaders. So this idea of developing community at different levels, and in some cases the need actually is more immediate. You'll see in a few minutes what my first assignment was focused on, and you'll see why I'm saying that. And actually, that's somewhat true of some of the other assignments. So actually, one of the things I think I mentioned somewhere in here, graffiti boards. So my colleague had introduced me to this idea of a graffiti board, and there's ways of doing it where you put poster paper up on it and you ask the students to draw. But you can also use a graffiti board online. So that gets me back to one of the reasons why I like this idea of a blog, because you could use multimedia. It wasn't just restricted to text entries. So this little slide here talks a little bit about graffiti boards. So again, it's visual, and it's another way of tapping into a student's knowledge. And sometimes they don't even know they have that knowledge, but again, it's sort of capturing that in a little bit different way. Even when they're not that great a drawer, sometimes it's actually really surprising the quality of the work that emerges from the student. So again, the graffiti board is very visual, and my colleague, she's an environmental psychologist, so she's got a whole different way of looking at information than we scientists do. So she also introduced me to cognitive maps, which also get into this idea of tapping into the brain in a little bit different way. And I've got some examples of cognitive map, including the classic example, which is this one from Dolores Hayden, where I think this was from the 1950s, where she asked people in California to draw maps of how far they travel in their daily lives from where they exist. And you can see there are marked differences, and at that time there were huge differences between the Caucasian community versus the African American community versus the Hispanic community. This is again in California. I forget which city it was based in. So the tiny little blip over here is the Hispanic community. Some of it may have to do with language barriers as well, in a socioeconomic situation, but language also has to factor in there. And that, not even comfortable going out of the little cocoon of an area. So that was something that really struck me and stayed with me. So going back to what I was saying, is sometimes the students need to be almost immediately, if they're interested in health issues, be community leaders. I don't know if you remember the Zika virus situation a few years back. It's not that long back. One of the things I'm fascinated by as a microbiologist is emerging infectious diseases. So this, it's been around since 1947, the virus, but it really exploded on us right before the Olympics a couple of years back, the 2016 Olympics in Brazil. And it was this huge outbreak. So I decided to focus on Zika virus that semester. And this was actually the first semester I decided I was going to go for it with a blog assignment. So I wanted their answers, the responses to be rich. And this is a complex situation. So I set it up as a scaffolded assignment leading to allowing them to hopefully get to, being able to do a rich answer to a blog. So our department has in the fall a science day, in the spring we have Earth Day. So I've done this over actually 3 semester variations of this. So I usually start with a discussion in class during our either Science Day or Earth Day. The first semester I was doing it was actually Earth Day. And then, because it's a writing intensive course, some of the writing they're doing are tied to take-home components to lecture exams. So I have a set of questions that deal with some basic microbiology, and you'll see those assignments in a few minutes to help lay the groundwork so that they hopefully can, do to actually answer in I think as I said, in a rich fashion, something that's useful to them as a learning experience and to help their students, fellow students, learn. So there's this discussion in class. They're given literature on this. There are those take-home questions that lay them back to the textbook to help them cull out the information that to give them the foundation information. And then there's the actual, and actually in this case, part of that assignment was asking them to do a cognitive map, which I asked them to put on the blog, and you'll see a small number of those cognitive maps in a couple of minutes. And then there's a very open-ended question that I asked them to answer. And it was done as an extra credit, but most of the students ended up doing that. So I asked them basically to think about their local environment and think about how mosquito-proof they are. Because hopefully you remember Zika virus is transmitted by mosquitoes, in particular Aedes aegypti or Aedes albopictus, which could theoretically be in the New York area. There is that possibility. So I provided them with my own cognitive map, where I'm showing them I live over here. This is a gully in the back where a train runs by, and I've got a broken screen in the apartment, and I'll go like gate high. Actually, that screen is not the problem. I've got other broken screens, but I've got like a gulf where mosquitoes, if they were there, could enter into the apartment very easily. There are places where water tends to linger, and I don't know if you realize mosquitoes can lay the larvae, and they can, even in a little bottle cap of water, they can do their thing. So there are all these different considerations. So I'm showing them my neighborhood. Okay, and you'll see in a few minutes some of their own pictures. 10 minutes? Crap. Okay. Okay, so this is the blog question on the Zika virus, asking them to pretend to be a public health official, and how would they go to their community, family members, etc., and ask them to think about how they would prevent the spread of the Zika virus if it were to come to New York City, or how to mitigate its effects. And you may remember, it's not just transmitted by mosquitoes; it's also transmitted by people infected, and if they have unprotected sex, there's a potential for it to be transmitted to women, including pregnant women, and led to microencephaly. So there were babies being born with heads where the brains were really tremendously incapacitated and shrunk essentially in size. Okay, so this is the series of questions. Some of them are more writing to learn structured, where it's like asking them a short answer, pulling information from the textbook, and in some cases I'm asking them, okay, what kind of transmission is this? Explain your answer. So there's some places where they're asked to write more, other places where it's somewhat reduced, but it's laying that foundation down for them. Okay, so this is a continuation of epidemiology questions. This gets into some of the interesting immunology of it with antibodies, formation, and there was an issue with Zika virus with Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is where the antibodies potentially are cross-reactive and reacting to nerve tissue, which is true of Campylobacter. So from the textbook, I actually pulled that information from the Campylobacter situation so that they can cross-reference it to the Zika virus with the right prompting in the assignment. And this is one example of a student's cognitive map. This is another one. And this student is a great fantastic artist. In his previous lifetime, before he joined the nursing program, he was actually an artist. Okay, and that was a reminder of the question. And we've got some very nice lengthy responses. Some of it is pretty pedantic in terms of, basic, okay, Zika virus, blah, blah, blah. But there was actually a pretty lively exchange. So I know we don't really have enough time to really go back and forth, but you can see student 3 said, student 1 responded, student 4 said. So there was a good going back and forth on this. Okay.
Was this using Blackboard's blog?
Yes, it was. Yeah.
You didn't change anything.
I put the prompts in, put the resources in for them to avail themselves of, and we got 5 minutes. Okay, so I did this assignment for 3 semesters. Then I decided to switch gears. As we know, we've got a new administration in the last couple of years, the U.S. government administration, and there were attacks on the Affordable Care Act, essentially Obamacare. I was concerned about whether this healthcare system would allow people who are high risk for being infected with the AIDS virus, having Truvada available, PrEP available. There's fake news, alternative facts, etc. So this is the extra slide I needed to kick out. So I had actually, that other slide was from when I used the movie and the band played on previously in a scaled down way. But I decided to use in the band played on again. I'm also part of the Women and Gender Studies Committee, and so we have a film series. But I decided to really expand on this to tie it really nicely with the microbiology and all of this other stuff that was going on. So I showed the movie again with my colleague that I work with often. Actually, she was mentioned in the earlier slide. And then I also showed it again in my microbiology class and built on it. And this is a little blurb about the movie. It's a wonderful movie that talks about the beginnings of the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s. So it does a wonderful job showing scientific method. It really shows the devastating effects of HIV when chemotherapeutic agents are not available. And so again, structured very much like what I did with the other assignment. I give them some questions that deal with the epidemiology to give them a foundation on this. And then I gave them a blog assignment asking them to take a position about if there's a question about whether Truvada will continue to be made available. Like in New York State, we make it available with very low cost. It's very expensive. And there are some issues with it. There are some health issues, side effect issues with it. But I asked them to take a position. They're now aware how devastating HIV can be when it causes full-blown AIDS. What some of the costs in the healthcare system when somebody is infected and you have to provide them with all the chemotherapy like AZT, the heart cocktails. So I asked them to again write in a blog entry, about whether they would defend, continuing providing Truvada to people who are at risk or not. Okay, so some of the resources I provided them with, and then a number of the responses. In this case, I didn't have as much time, so there's a little less back and forth with the students, but there were some very nice answers here. Okay, and I'm going to speed through this because I know I'm just about out of time, but I do want to get to the last one, which has to do with measles vaccination. And now we know we're really in a crisis mode. I started using this assignment last semester, and I'm going to tinker with it a little bit more and use it again. So I found a lovely article a number of years back on measles, how it's not just the vaccination, how it doesn't just protect against measles, because it turns out the measles virus knocks out immunological memory. So if somebody had a staph infection, a strep throat infection, they have that memory knocked out. So when they recover from the measles, if they're lucky enough to recover from measles, because measles can be life-threatening, they might then be prone to getting another staph infection from the same strain even, or strep pyogenes, etc. Okay, so I used the same article again, but I developed a set of questions, which I forgot to put the slide in here for that. But then I asked them again, with this crisis going on, would you, how would you go about, trying to convince people who are like anti-vaxxers to get their kids vaccinated? Then also a number of other reasons why people don't get their children vaccinated, choose not to be vaccinated, but that's one key issue. So I'm asking them, develop the evidence. How would you convince people to get themselves vaccinated? What I want to tinker with is, because it's getting even more complicated these days, with the a crisis now, we have over 700 people with measles across the country. We've got past like the high mark for from 25 years back, when we thought in 2000 that we eradicated measles from the U.S. Okay, but people do move around and travel and bring it back in and find the right pocket of individuals that are not vaccinated. You know what happens. You've seen it in the news. Hopefully not directly experienced it. So these are a few of the postings, 1 minute. Okay, and again, I'm sort of going through this. So I've gotten some very good answers. One of the students actually even went back and referenced the Wakefield article, which started the whole thing with the supposed linking measles to autism, which has been totally debunked, and he had to recant the article. He fabricated his data. But trying to convince the people who are like so firmly rooted in this, trying to convince them otherwise is not so easy to do. So that's basically it. So we're going to keep tinkering with this style of assignment, but I found it to be really valuable. And I've actually had students come to me without my saying anything to them, how they feel that it does give them a sense of community. So one of my aims has been achieved. So thank you.